and welcome back to another gaming review with yours truly, Tambourine Panda. Today we're going to be discussing the game Outriders by studio People Can Fly, published by Square Enix, the sister to, or the follow-up to Marvel's Avengers by Square Enix as well. This game highlights the RPG looter shooter genre, and the story involves you as an outrider running around on a dangerous and untamed planet, the planet of Enoch, trying to help save the last vestiges of the human race. So let's go ahead and dive right on into our first topic, which is the character development and story. At its premise, Outriders doesn't really do anything as far as game changing in regards to the looter shooter RPG genre. The character development and the story, as far as this game is concerned, is pretty straightforward. You are an outrider who is trying to save the last vestiges of humanity on this planet of Enoch. You have escaped Earth, which is crumbling and dying. And you have taken a bunch of refugees to this planet Enoch. However, you come to find out that there is something called this anomaly on the planet of Enoch, which knocks out all of your electronics, destroys all of your spaceships, and basically strands you and the rest of the human race on this planet of Enoch, leaving you in the same position that you were in when you left the planet of Earth. Enter the Outriders and the Altereds. Now, the beginning of the story takes place where you're out on a mission, seemingly a recovering mission or some sort of scouting mission, and you run into this anomaly. And the anomaly itself is very interesting, very almost godlike powers can be bestowed on some people, whereas some people it just nukes them from the inside out, kind of turns them inside out sort of thing. Some people it changes, it mutates them, and the very, very rare few it grants them or bestows upon them godlike powers, and that is what happens to your character. Now, at the very end of the kind of intro or prologue portion of the story, you're pushed into a cryo chamber and essentially frozen for 30 some odd years, only to be awoken later and thrust back into the action of Enoch 30 years later. You come to find out that there is war and insurgents, and you're essentially, like I said, fighting for the same thing that you're fighting for and why you left Earth in the first place. Minimal resources, warring factions, destroying the planet, all that sort of fun apocalyptic tropey sort of stuff with Outriders. At its very core, it's a survival RPG looter shooter game, where you're taking the last remnants of humanity and forging a path ahead. You're kind of a godlike being that has all these crazy powers, and you're trying to find some sort of order to the chaos that is this planet, and trying to restore the bonds between humanity, sort of thing. So it's a very interesting story. It wasn't so grabbing that I was moved to any sort of real emotions at the end of the game, but it was certainly intriguing enough that I would be interested to see where the story goes from here. We're not talking about a story like The Last of Us 2 that's supposed to pull you in and challenge you emotionally and ask you really tough psychological, ethical questions. This is, at its core, it's blood and guts and gore, and we're forging a path ahead for humanity, and, kind of ethics and all these things be damned. There are obviously some emotional moments to this story, but like I said, it's certainly not a game that you play to play for the story, if that makes sense. As far as the character development and the story, I would call it average. I wouldn't say it was over the top or genre changing or emotionally evoking in any sort of game changing way, but it was good enough to keep me compelled and want to see where the story goes from here. Moving into the next section of Outriders, we're going to talk about the overall gameplay of this game, and while the game does have somewhat of an open world aesthetic to it, the main story is very linear. You're supposed to go from point A to point B to point C, etc., etc. Now there are side quests, there are different little kind of group quests that you can do where do a bunch of these side quests and get a big reward at the end of it. There are historian quests like that, bounties and hunts, where with the historian quests you go through and you find a bunch of different archives from humanity's past, and you bring those back to this particular person in your first main town area. And once you collect or do all 10 of those, you get a nice, legendary piece of gear. Same thing with the bounties and the hunts. The bounties, you go hunt captains or human NPCs. The hunts, you go hunt animals or creatures. And again, you turn all of those in for rewards. And then when you do all of them, which is 10 total of each, you get a nice legendary reward at the end of that. There is the main story right now, which I would say if you drive through the game as quickly as you can on the easiest setting that you can probably finish the main story in about 15 to 20 hours. If you decide to divert and do all the side questing, or you decide to, like I did on my very first playthrough, which is push it to the hardest world tier difficulty, which is 15 in this game through the main story, and 15 for expeditions as well too, and we'll talk about that in a minute. It does take a little bit longer. I'd say roughly about 35 to 40 hours to get through the main story. There are 4 different classes that you can play, 4 different Outriders specs, if you will. There is the Pyromancer, there's the Technomancer, there's the Trickster, and there's the Devastator. The expeditions, this is the end game sort of mechanic with this particular game, where you grind these difficult expeditions for legendary upgrades or gear upgrades. And very specifically, if you max, now I'll talk about this kind of separately here. The expeditions are the end game mechanic, and you use that to grind your level 50 gear. That's the highest that gear level can go in this game. If you max out to world tier 15 in main story, you can get up to level 32 gear, I believe. I'm sorry, 42 gear. You can get up to level 42 gear. Now, what I mean by what you might be asking yourself, what do you mean by world tier and challenge tier? This game has something very similar to Diablo 3's Rift or challenge system, in that you can increase the difficulty. So like the Torment system in Diablo 3 is very similar. The world tier system is very similar in this game to the Torment difficulty in Diablo 3, where if you increase it, you get a higher chance of higher gear drops. The enemies scale up higher, but the gear that you receive scales up higher. Now, the only thing that you can do in this game, as far as your character, is max out at level 30, but with these higher difficulties you can get gear level that reaches up to, as I said earlier, level 50 in the expeditions. Now, these two particular systems are separate from one another, so if you hit world tier 15 in the main story, that doesn't automatically transfer over to your expeditions to where you hit challenge tier 15. It'll probably start you somewhere around challenge tier 7 or 8, and then you work up from there to get to your level 50 challenge tier 15 max level. That's kind of the end game of the end game in regards to the expeditions. So there's a bunch of different working things. Now, I will say this, in my opinion, the expeditions are starting to get a little bit repetitive and monotonous. So I do hope to see some sort of end game DLC, or, as I mentioned earlier, an expansion maybe to the main story. But People Can Fly have some things to do to resolve some issues, and we'll talk about that when we get into the developer. But now I want to get into the combat system of this particular game. So the next thing we're going to talk about in regard to Outriders is the combat system. Now, I mentioned a little bit about this in the previous section with the gameplay, because you can't talk about the gameplay of the game without talking about the combat system. Now, at its core, this is a third-person role-playing game, RPG shooter, looter shooter, as we like to call it here in the gaming community. And the combat system is a good one. It's very reminiscent of the Division 2, Gears of War with its covering system. Again, the world tier and the challenge tier difficulty reminds me of Diablo with its torment system. There's drops that remind me very much of those games as well too. Little hints of Borderlands and Destiny in there as well. So again, in regard to the combat system, it's not really breaking any sort of new ground, or isn't, you know, it's not like someone in the development team had an epiphany about changing everything about the combat system of looter shooters. It's run around, use your abilities, shoot enemies, kill enemies, and loot at its very core. Now, the one thing I will give Outriders and People Can Fly credit for is each of their class systems seems to be very unique in its own way. Now, I will say that, and I will put a caveat to that. The Devastator is one of the, I would say, weaker classes in this game, in my opinion, as it doesn't do as much damage output as the rest of the classes and doesn't really have any tanking capability in the RPG sense, that you hit an enemy, you take its aggro, and it doesn't attack your enemies and your allies, so that your allies can then do heaps and heaps of damage to the mobs. It would be really nice to see the developers add some sort of aggro generation system to the Devastators so that they could truly be a tank class when they're in a group. Obviously, when you're solo, this isn't an issue, but I do think that the Devastator does still need a little bit of work. Now, with them saying that this is not going to be a live service game, I'm not sure how many tweaks or changes or balancing patches they're going to release in regard to the classes. But that doesn't take away from the point that each class does seem to be very unique in its own fighting style. Again, like I mentioned in the gameplay section, the Technomancer and the Pyromancer seem to be more Pyromancer more mid to long range, Technomancer more long range and support, whereas the Trickster and the Devastator both seem to be more close range classes, whereas the Devastator's kind of right in everybody's face. The Trickster's more of the jumping around, teleporting behind enemies, doing heaps of damage from behind with shotguns, and their bullet class ability from the backside, as well as debuffing armor and all that sort of stuff. So in a group setting, these three different classes definitely offer synergies and combinations with their abilities that are really unique. Definitely offer kind of the answer to the puzzle that is each of these battle situations that you run into. The main story is very straightforward. You push forward, you encounter groups of enemies, you beat them, you push forward more. Whereas the expeditions seem to be more of an arena-like setting where you get into an area, you fight a bunch of enemies, again, you move forward to the next area, but they all seem to be in big kind of arena-type rooms. I've actually heard the comparison made to the Doom series, whereas this isn't first-person push-forward kind of aggressive shooting game. There are very arena-like areas where you are running around in one particular area and trying to best establish how to approach the combat situation, which is kind of similar to Doom in that regard. So a lot of different elements going into the combat system of this particular game, and they all come together quite nicely. Now, again, there are some issues with regard to the Trickster and the Devastator, which we've talked about, and we'll talk about more when we get to the developer aspect of this particular review. But for now, that kind of sums up the combat of this particular game, Outriders. We're going to move on to the graphics of the game next. The next section we're going to talk about here in this review is going to be the graphics for the game overall. Now, I don't, in all of the reviews that I've done, I don't typically value the graphical integrity of a game to be as important as, say, the story or the development or the gameplay or the combat. But it is certainly something that we as gamers appreciate. We can appreciate those wow factors, those god rays, the ray tracing elements in these current gen consoles and PC builds. And when developers make the best of it, it certainly adds another wow factor to the game experience. Now, This particular game is not something that you're gonna load up and be immediately amazed by how beautiful the world is, but I will say this: there are certainly a wide variety of environments for you to explore through the main story, and again in the expeditions once you get to the end game section, that really give you a sense of just how unique this planet of Enoch is, and I was really pleased with it. When you move to a new area, it felt like you moved to a new area. There was new aesthetics, new environments. I do think that some of the creature skinning could have been a little better, or maybe some more enemies that were more unique to the areas that we were in, but overall I think People Can Fly did a really good job of illustrating the different environments that your player goes through as you progress through the main story. And again, they illustrate those environments in each of the different expeditions once you get to the end game portion of this game. Now, as far as next gen, again, this isn't going to blow you away when you load it up. There are certainly breathtaking cutscenes, and the overall aesthetic tends to be pretty good and clean, and clear and crisp. However, I do notice, at least on PC anyway, that at least with the game itself, even if you're running it on low settings in 1080p, while I'm streaming it, it tends to drop frames and stutter a lot, and I'm not sure if it's just my PC starting to get to the end of its legs here, or me needing a second PC, but I don't typically have these sorts of issues with any other game unless it's like Apex or it's Warzone, and I'm wondering if it's the first person aspect to it or not. But I digress. The graphics of the game, you can certainly tell it was made for previous gen and current gen consoles. I'm curious to see if there's going to be any kind of next gen upgrades with this in regard to the PS5, or if that exists already, what it looks like on the PS5. In 4K ultra settings on the PC, it looks pretty good. I don't know if this is just me or if this is the game itself, but the HDR settings seem to be overly saturated currently in the game, and I'm not sure if that's me messing something up, but typically in any other game I can just flip the HDR settings on and it looks beautiful and gorgeous with the lighting effects. And this looks like it's totally oversaturated with coloring and all that sort of stuff. And I know People Can Fly have mentioned something about lighting effects and making changes to that sort of stuff. So I'm wondering if that setting isn't something that's on my end or on the developer's end, but it would be nice if they could fix that up, because it would make it look even more beautiful, and kind of bring it up to that next gen kind of standing in my book. So as far as the graphical integrity of the game is concerned, it's not going to blow you away. It serves the purpose for current gen, and PS4 and Xbox Ones as well too. The last part we're going to talk about here in this review is the developer themselves, People Can Fly. They are the developer of this game. It was published by Square Enix. And I will say that the launch of this game was not the greatest. The servers had many issues. Me and my friends pretty much spent that entire first weekend of release constantly on loading screens, constantly trying to get into the server. And I will say this, in regards to live service or live connection games where you need to be online to play them, even if you want to play them solo, a word of warning to game developers when they're making future products: don't do that, because when your servers go down the first couple of days, you're going to have a lot of upset people on your hands. Now, in regard to that, I will give People Can Fly a lot of credit. They were very transparent during the process, giving very frequent updates on Twitter and on Reddit as to what they were doing. The issue was relatively resolved within that first weekend, and it was Easter weekend, a holiday here in the States. So kudos to them for working on that through the holiday weekend and keeping us up to date. Furthermore, now we're running into the concern of balancing issues. There have been many complaints on Twitter and Reddit about shadow nerfing happening in this game. All of a sudden, one day a player will go from doing a challenge tier 13 expedition expedition and doing it without an issue and getting gold tier status. By the way, there's gold, silver, and bronze in those expeditions if you hit a certain time. Again, very similar to the rifting system in Diablo 3. But people claiming that they were easily able to hit gold tier status in these expeditions solo without a problem, and now they're getting, you know, they're super squishy and getting one shot and killed and not even able to make it past the first room in some of these expeditions. So me and my buddy got on today. It's May the 3rd, and we got on today to see if we could get some recording done for this particular review, and we didn't seem to encounter any of the issues that these folks said that they were running into. We easily timed the tier 13 expeditions that we did for the footage for this review, but that could also be because they've released something else that they maybe have not communicated, or perhaps I just haven't checked their Twitter or Reddit in the last couple of days and they've communicated something since the last patch. What I'm curious to see is if there are any DLC or expansions planned for this game. I know there's certainly interest enough to warrant that. Like I said earlier in the review, the main story leaves things very open-ended for you to kind of wonder, hey, what's gonna happen next? And the expeditions, while they kind of expound upon that a little bit, they don't really take it too much further. So I would like to see maybe another main story expansion or a DLC in regard to this game. I've got to give People Can Fly credit for working as diligently as they have been on this game. I'm just worried at this point that they have lost people's interests and people are gonna start fleeing or leaving this game in droves. Now, there was an article that I had just read recently from Paul Tassi from Forbes that stated that despite dwindling numbers, the game does still seem to be popular with the people who are still playing it. So maybe we run into an issue here that's very similar to like Fallout 76, where a bunch of people leave the game and the very dedicated few who play the game are really dedicated to seeing it succeed, and we'll see what happens with that. For my own personal experience, I would love to see them do some more development with this game. I'd love to see them balance some things out in regard to the creatures and the NPCs, which we've talked about constantly on the streams that I stream. By the way, if you guys want to catch live streams of me, I stream daily over on Twitch at 12 p.m. Central Standard Time. I'll make sure a link to that is in the description below. In regards to this particular game, I would have to give it a 7 out of 10 as my final score. Would I recommend buying this game? Now I think would be a good time to do that. If you want to spend your $60 on this game, I would say yes. If we were a month ago, I would say no, hold off and wait until they've stabilized their servers a little bit. They've stabilized crossplay, and they've stabilized, you know, connectivity between peer-to-peer, which seems to have happened since they released the game. But now they are dealing with some other issues in regard to balancing the game and the game mechanics itself. So I do hope that they can get these issues resolved sooner rather than later. Again, my final score for this game is a 7 out of 10. I would recommend buying it. Maybe not even for the full 60. Maybe wait till it goes on sale and then go ahead and scoop it up after it goes on sale. I don't know if I could feasibly recommend paying the entire $60 for this game right now until they get things kind of patched up and fixed up. I've heard a lot of people comparing this to Cyberpunk. That is a bad take in my opinion. Cyberpunk still does not exist on the PlayStation Store, or maybe they just put it back up on the PlayStation Store. I'm not 100% certain on that, but this game is far and away in a better place than Cyberpunk ever was. So bad take in my opinion on that. This game is better and was better on release than Cyberpunk was, and I have faith that People Can Fly will continue to work on this and resolve it. From all of us here at Tambourine Panda, thank you so much for tuning on in today. Make sure to drop a like and a subscribe on the channel if you did enjoy the content. Make sure to check out all my social media links posted in the description below, and we'll catch you on the next one. Take care, everybody.